Hey everyone, Darren Eastman here, Product Manager for GitLab Runner. For today's demo, I'm going to cover how to build a Docker image using the GitLab Runner AWS Fargate custom executor driver plus AWS CodeBuild. This is actually building on the demo that I had created a few months back, but since then we've had some additional questions that come up. So I thought it was important and interesting perhaps to have a second demo and provide a bit more context and a bit more detail. This demo was actually based on a blog post that was published some time back by Elliot Rushton, Engineering Manager for GitLab Runner, Ricardo Mendez from CIMT, and the blog post is titled, How to Build Containers with the AWS Fargate Custom Executor for GitLab Runner and AWS CodeBuild. And the reason that this particular blog post was put together, and the reason for the demo tonight, is that AWS Fargate does not allow containers to run in privileged mode. So for our users and for our customers that are interested in using Amazon ECS clusters followed by AWS Fargate, the next question that pretty much comes up is, hey, how can I now build a Docker container if I'm using that solution in my CI workflows? So let's go over cover a few slides before we actually get into the demo itself. So today I'm just going to in terms of what the demo will cover, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the EC2 virtual machine configuration. That's the virtual machine that we're using for hosting the runner, or what we might call in this particular instance, the runner manager. Basically, a high-level review of the ECS cluster powered by Fargate. I'm going to touch on the setup of the container image used to create the CI build container on the ECS cluster. This is the container that executes the scripts in the CI job, right? And that pattern is covered in our docs on setting up the AWS Fargate driver. I'm going to link to those docs in the slides as well. I'm going to touch on the setup of the AWS CodeBuild project. Just a few key points there. The container registry. I'm going to touch on the setup of the project repository in GitLab, and then touch on a few of some key points in the setup of the GitLab-CI, the YAML file. And then finally, I'll execute the pipeline, which will demonstrate the building of the Docker image, which is a combination of the pipeline job executing using the GitLab Runner on Fargate along with CodeBuild. So what the demo will not cover, I won't be covering deploying the deployment of the build container image to a production environment on AWS using something like code deploying. I also will be covering the setup of an on-demand GitLab Runner Manager. An on-demand GitLab Runner Manager. This is a configuration that I've defined as one that does not require that a virtual machine on EC2 be always on hosting a runner manager. I'll link to resources with that pattern, but I won't be covering that in today's demo. So the first thing I want to just kind of touch on before we get into the demo is an overview of the setup. And this is sort of the prerequisite steps one has to go to before using the GitLab Runner on EC2 along with the Fargate driver. And this particular slide, what I'm showing here is the container image used for the CI job execution that I'll be demonstrating in the actual demo on the ECS cluster powered by Fargate. This is a very basic Docker file. Here's going to be creating a Node.js image. The only thing I want to call out that's different in this example versus the one that's linked to in the blog post I referenced earlier is that I've included the AWS CLI in here because we'll be actually executing a few AWS CLI commands as part of our pipeline job. Right, so just kind of want to call that out. We've added those steps in here as well, and just wanted to highlight that that's kind of how that's built. So I've built my container image. I've included AWS CLI into that container image. And the other thing to call out as well, which is and this is covered in the installation or the configuration docs for the Fargate driver. Here is where you're seeing that we have included the GitLab Runner. Right, so the container used for executing the CI job on the Fargate powered ECS cluster must include an installation of the GitLab Runner. So this requirement we cover in detail, we describe this in detail in the autoscaling GitLab CI AWS Fargate docs. So let me just pop over there for a quick second to give you a bit of context. These are the docs I'm referring to. Autoscaling GitLab CI AWS Fargate. We have a prerequisite section, and then we go through various steps that you need to follow if you're setting up this pattern for the first time. And the step one is preparing a container image for the AWS Fargate task. And so this is what I'm referring to in that example. And here in the docs, we provide a Debian example and a Node.js example repositories for both that you can link to, and you can copy those repositories. But I just wanted to call that out just to add a bit more context in terms of what's needed as you're setting up this pattern. The other thing I did as I was setting up my project in GitLab for this demo, and the name of the project I'll be using is CodeBuild Fargate-example, is that I included a CodeBuild project variable and an S3 bucket variable. Again, this is just going to make it easier to reuse these examples in other top products and so on. So instead of hard coding these in the scripts, we can set these as environment variables in the actual GitLab project itself. In terms of the CodeBuild configuration, AWS is doing a fantastic job of documenting how to use CodeBuild. They provide a number of example patterns and getting starting guides. But I just want to call out that in terms of using the pattern that we're going to demonstrate today, the key thing that you want to make sure is done is as you're setting up your CodeBuild project, you want to have these environment variables set. In this particular case, the AWS default region, and the account ID, image repo name, and image tag. And this is because, as you can see here, we're using these variables in the build-spec.yaml file that will be, or that is in the GitLab project repository. And so that's how we're stitching all of these things together. So these environment variables are set in the CodeBuild project, and then we're using these variables in the build-spec.yaml file. And then finally, just a quick overview of the setup of the GitLab-CI.yaml file. So this is a very basic GitLab CI YAML file. Before I call out what's highlighted here, if you'll notice from lines 12 through 19, sort of this debug job section, this is something I included early on as a means for me to quickly test whether or not my prerequisite steps in terms of setting up the build environment on an AWS, i.e. the runner that's hosted on the EC2 instance, the Fargate cluster, the task definition, if all of that implementation was working as expected. So that I'm able to execute this very simple, quote-unquote, debug job manually. And it's just basically going to be doing some very simple things. It's going to be doing a quick echo out just to see, hey, the build container or the task is starting on AWS Fargate, i.e. the container. I'm able to do a quick echo out. And then I've also included a couple of simple AWS commands, so exercising the AWS CLI. So a very quick and easy way for you to test whether or not the basic setup is working before you get into something a bit more, how should I say, intricate. You're stitching together and you're using things like AWS CodeBuild or something like that in terms of the end-to-end workflow. And then finally, for the demo, we set this job to be manual. Obviously, in your environment, a production environment, there are much more elegant ways in terms of how you may want the workflows to be kicked off, but for the purpose of the demo, it's set for manual. And the only other thing to call out here is that, let's exit that so I can come back to that. Go back in. The only other thing I want to call out is that we are using a bash script. Let's go back here. It keeps highlighting. It's kind of hard to see, so let's just zoom in. Okay, let me see if we can see that. Okay, and so this bash script here, which is going to be in our scripts directory, is called CodeBuild.sh. That bash script is actually what's going to be responsible for executing the steps in the CodeBuild project. And what a bash script will do, it implements a timer, which basically allows for the execution of the jobs that's being managed by GitLab Runner to wait for the completion of the corresponding jobs, if you will, on CodeBuild. So that's what that batch script and what the timer is doing. It's like, hey, it's waiting for sort of like the confirmation that the jobs that have been kicked off on CodeBuild, which is obviously a separate environment, if you will, from sort of your core GitLab Runner implementation. Those jobs have completed before it wraps up the closure of the pipeline jobs on GitLab. And then really fast, this is a quick overview of the build-spec.yaml file. The only thing I want to call out here is this is a very simple pattern. It's one that you can get by just going directly to AWS's CodeBuild documentation. Nothing very intricate here. It's par for the course. All right, so just a quick review of the end-to-end solution and the demo steps before we go into the actual demo. So this is kind of what everything looks like when stitched together. So you have your user, in this case it's going to be me. In this particular example, in this particular demo, the project repository that I'm using is hosted on GitLab.com. I'm using the SaaS version of GitLab.com, so my project repo is on GitLab.com. If you're a self-managed customer, you obviously have your own instance of GitLab. You replace the GitLab.com section with your own instance of GitLab. My project repository is CodeBuild on Fargate-example, and what I've done here is ahead of time, I have registered a specific runner to that project repository, and that runner is called AWS EC2 Fargate-runner-manager and then you can see the IP address. So over here on the right hand side, you can see the configuration in CodeBuild. I've previously set up an EC2 instance, EC2 virtual machine. I've installed GitLab Runner. I've configured GitLab Runner to use a custom executor. I've installed the Fargate driver, got all that configured. I've created my ECS cluster. I've created my task definition that's based on the Node.js example that I showed earlier. I've created my S3 buckets. That would be the repository of the zip file that's created over here. I've created my CodeBuild project. So this is the end-to-end workflow that allows you to kick off your pipeline jobs, have those jobs be executed on build containers hosted on hosted on an ECS cluster powered by AWS Fargate, and then the resulting container image being pushed, handled by CodeBuild in terms of getting built, and then being pushed out to, in this particular case of my demo, an ECR repository. So in terms of my demo steps, I'm going to start the AWS CodeBuild pipeline job manually as step 1. Then what you'll see is that the runner manager and the EC2 instance that's configured to use the custom executor and the AWS Fargate driver will pick up the job. Right? We'll create a new task on the ECS cluster. The initial commands in the AWS step 3, the initial commands in the AWS CodeBuild pipeline job will zip the build spec.yaml file, the Docker file, app.js, and the package.json files into an S3, zip it up. That S3 file will then be copied to an S3 bucket. And then step 4, the AWS CodeBuild pipeline job will call the CodeBuild.sh bash script. I'm sorry, but let's go back. We'll call the CodeBuild.sh bash script, right? And that will take care of executing the job on CodeBuild that finishes everything together. So that's the end-to-end flow. So let's go ahead and finally, before we actually jump in the demo, I've included a few resources here in the presentation. Once I upload this video to YouTube, I'll also enter links to the resources directly into the video description as well. But a number of various resource links. The very last link on the bottom is a blog post that gives folks an example pattern of implementing the runner in a sort of an on-demand or serverless way, i.e. if folks are interested in not having an EC2 instance, always be active, always be running, in terms of always be running and hosting a runner, here's a potential pattern that one may implement in terms of a serverless pattern. And we might cover that in a future video. All right, so get out of this and we'll go into the actual demo itself. So this is my CodeBuild on Fargate example project. Before I kick off the actual pipeline, just a quick review of the repository setup is pretty straightforward. Here's the build spec, the YAML file that I referred to earlier. It's there at the root level of the repository. The Docker file that I'll be building as part of this, very simple, very straightforward. Again, this is the same example that's referenced in the blog post, how to build containers. The only thing that I did differently from the example in the blog post is I moved a few things around. I created a scripts directory and I moved the CodeBuild.sh file into the scripts directory. And this was just going to allow me later on to add other script files in here as well and reference them a little bit simpler. So we've got that. And then finally, as we referenced earlier, the GitLab YAML file. So for the demo, we'll only be executing manually this job, the AWS CodeBuild job. So let's go back to pipelines. And we've got this one ready to go. Now, before we kick off that pipeline, we're just going to pop over here and show you how things currently look over on the Amazon side of things, on the AWS side of things. So over here on AWS, we've got my cluster. It's called GitLab-CI-builds-Fargate-cluster. Currently at this point, you'll see that there's nothing running. I've got some tasks, nothing is active. Let's take a quick look at my task definition that I, again, previously created. It's the one that's going to be kicked off as part of this job. So right now, here's my ECS cluster powered by Fargate. Nothing's currently active, nothing's running. We'll take a look over here. Let's close this one. Over here in ECR, this is a repository I've been building. Let's do a quick refresh and have a look at the latest timestamps. So the latest image tag, latest was pushed today at around 5:52 my time. So as part of this pipeline execution, we should see that timestamp refresh. So we'll take a look at that as we go through the demo. And then we'll go to the actual CodeBuild project here. And so we should also see that as part of the execution, we'll see a new entry in the build history table here in CodeBuild. So that's how all three of these things will stitch together. So let's go ahead and kick off the AWS CodeBuild job manually. Again, for the purpose of this demo, I have not implemented AWS CodeDeploy job, so we'll not be exercising that. And again, as I mentioned before, the debug job was just something that I implement myself, just as a way for me to quickly test to make sure my AWS configuration is working as expected before I do something a bit more intricate, like introducing CodeBuild or CodeDeploy or what have you. So initiate that job. Let's have a look and see what's happening. So now things are starting up here. And so you see it's starting from there. If we were to pop over right now to ECS, and just take a look, quickly refresh. There we go. So a task definition, a task just got kicked off based on the task definition. Let's see if it's running yet. So last state as of this time is pending. We can see the corresponding sort of like wait state, if you will, here on the GitLab side. And that's corresponding to the fact that over here on Fargate, the task as of right now, prior to refresh, this task is still pending. Give it a second. It actually kicked off. Okay then, so now things are happening over here is on the ECS side. Oh, by the way, so let me click over here. So that should have refreshed. And yes, now the actual container is running on ECS. Because what we're seeing here in the logs is that the execution of the job is actually happening, right? Because the container on Fargate is now active, right? And so we can see that the echo statement got kicked off. The zip command has been completed. And it's already uploaded the zip file to the S3 bucket. And then it's called the CodeBuild.sh bash script. So over here on that side, that task is still running. And if we go over to CodeBuild, let's do a refresh, we should see an update in terms of what's happening in CodeBuild. Right. So over here in CodeBuild, you can see that the status is in progress. And over here on the job that's being managed by the GitLab Runner, you can still see it's waiting. And again, this is because of the timer that we've implemented in CodeBuild. So now things have completed. So what must have happened at this point is that the execution of the jobs on the CodeBuild side are now done. And we can see that by going over here, do a refresh. So that's been succeeded. And just to kind of pop over here. So everything here on the GitLab side is complete, right? So on the GitLab side of things, it's telling you, hey, this job is complete. All right, job is succeeded. So now we want to go over and have a look at what has actually been done in AWS on AWS. So first things first, we want to click on the job here and in CodeBuild. You can click on the phase details, and you can see that all of the steps in the jobs have succeeded. There's some other additional stuff that you can get from CodeBuild as well. The build logs. In my case, I'm pumping my build logs to an S3 bucket. So if things fail, I can quickly download the build logs and take a look at the reasons why it failed. So again, so I've kicked off that pipeline job. The corresponding CodeBuild job has kicked off and is now completed. Now let's look at and see what's happened over on the ECR side. So we haven't refreshed the screen as yet. So right now the image tag latest was last pushed at approximately 5:52 p.m. So if we refresh now, we just see a different timestamp for the latest tag. Yes, indeed, the latest tag is now at 6:21 p.m. So to recap, what we've done is to go back to our slides and kind of come full circle. Let's go back to the presenter view here. What we've just, again, demonstrated is our project that's hosted in a GitLab.com instance, in my particular example on GitLab.com itself, right, is configured to use a GitLab runner that's hosted in AWS, and specifically will use an ECS cluster powered by Fargate to execute those tasks. Right, and so that's the easy piece of this. Is like, we set up a build container for the type of environment we did. In my example was a Node.js build container, and we then use that for executing the pipeline jobs. The other steps that we demonstrated as part of this demo was showing how we also now connect this whole sort of GitLab centric configuration to AWS CodeBuild, so that now we can have the ability to build a Docker image, right, as part of the overall workflow. All right, and this is again because AWS Fargate does not allow for privileged container builds. This pattern solves that problem. So what we've done again is we have executed the pipeline job on GitLab from GitLab, and the GitLab runner on our EC2 instance configured to use a Fargate driver has executed that job using the ECS cluster powered by Fargate, and pushed the resulting container image into the ECR repository. And again, the container image was built by AWS CodeBuild. Really fast before we wrap up the demo, this kind of one other thing I think I'll just quickly show is that in this example, we only kicked off, and then if we go back to ECS, we only kicked off one task. We only kicked off one container. You can see here now it stopped, right? And so the question one might have is, hey, could I have parallel jobs? Could I have parallel jobs be configured to use the task definition? And the answer is yes. So just really fast, I'll just do a quick example of that. So I'll go to pipelines again, and I actually have an example set up. And so in this example, I've got sort of 3 debug jobs that are set up in parallel, right? So what I'm calling this pre-build stage. And the reason I've set this up this way is just to quickly show what happens if one were to have multiple jobs that are executing in parallel. What happens correspondingly on the ECS cluster powered by Fargate in this implementation pattern. So let's just quickly take a look at that. So I'm going to kick off all 3 of those jobs. And then what will have happen over here on the ECS side, just to do a quick refresh, you'll see now we've got 1 container starting, 2 containers already running, 3 containers running. So what we've done is the runner manager, right here, is initiating creation of multiple tasks based on that, or multiple containers, if you will, a task to use the AWS parlance based on that task definition. So again, we have a lot of flexibility in this initial versions of the AWS Fargate driver that we developed. And if you have any questions or concerns or issues, please feel free to drop me an email, deeastman@gitlab.com. We also have a project repository as well, specific to this to the driver, and it's going to be linked here in the presentation, as well as I'll add that information into the description of the video. So that's it. That's it for our demo today. I hope you found this interesting, and look forward to chatting with you next time. Cheers.